All right, hello and welcome back to Real Seekers. I'm your host, Dale the Real Seeker. And so this is going to be a bonus solo show, once again, kind of following up. I did a Shroud show interview on the Complete Sinner's Guide with Teddi Pappas. And I also posted up her debate with Hugh Farey from Skeptics and Seekers show. And there was an after show that was, again, part of this Shroud episode that I want to post for people. But it's between two fundy-laced skeptics, David Johnson and Darren Lute, a couple of atheists. They're totally ignorant about the Shroud, and they are happy to admit it. But they were listening in to the debate between Teddi Pappas and Hugh Farey, the Shroud skeptic, and they kind of gave an after show giving their thoughts. So I want to review some of the points that they got as, kind of biased skeptics, absolutely, but as laymen, people that are totally ignorant about the evidence either way, what did they take away from it? And let me respond to that, because it's important to note how a lay audience is kind of making sense of all these scientific facts related to the Shroud and how they're putting it together. So I kind of want to see what they thought, and then I want to respond to what they're saying in terms of their objections or criticisms against the powerful evidence from the Shroud of Turin. Okay, so with that said, let's get into the first part that I want to address. Oh, and actually, before we do that, just by way as an announcement, we're having another special guest. Dr. Egil German is coming back on next week to discuss his new ministry that he's just got up and going, and we're going to discuss various general issues related to Christian apologetics, his ministry, and how he's reaching out as a scholar to try to win people to Christ. So look forward to that. And I'm going to hopefully work on my Jesus Mythicism Refuted solo show and get that completed in the next couple weeks. Again, I'm almost done that, but just have some things to work out with school in terms of my thesis paper. That's being due. Rough version of that's due March 1st. So trying my best to get these shows out as much as possible. But yeah, after this one, definitely Dr. Egil German is scheduled for next week. So yeah, with that, let's get into listening to what the skeptics, David and Darren Lute, think about the debate between Teddi and Hugh Farey.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back. This is David. I'm with Darren, and we're just going to do a real quick after show. So that was an interesting discussion, to say the least. You still alive over there, Darren?
Oh yeah. Just following. I had some questions, but I didn't want to jump in and derail the conversation they were having. So.
Oh, all I wanted to do was jump in and derail the conversation. What are you talking about? I felt so lost, and I'm not doing this from my comfy chair. So my office. I'll just give a brief description of it. It's a pretty good sized room, for an apartment anyway. And my desk is about 4 feet, 4 by 2.5 thereabouts. And that's kind of sitting over on one side, one kind of corner of the room, and then in another corner next to me is a comfy, lazy boy-like reclining chair and my notebook. And sometimes I do my podcasts from over there with my microphone set up, hooked up to my notebook. Today I'm in my desk, at my desk in my desk chair. It's not nearly as comfortable, and I just wanted to get it over with. I'm sorry. In my comfy chair, I could have snoozed. Not here. Not here. So I also wasn't kidding at the end of. Well, I was kidding, but I wasn't kidding. I wasn't exaggerating about how lost I got through this conversation. I mean, honestly, there was after about the first 5 minutes, I'm thinking, should I have paid more attention in chemistry? Because I don't understand. I don't know these words, and I can't look them up fast enough.
Yeah, it's one of those things that it's like everything else. It's a vocabulary that you have to learn if you want to actually actually do any studies for the Shroud. And unfortunately, the Shroud proponents can use, I guess both sides can use the language to sort of mislead or just say things that aren't true, and no one picks it up because they just don't understand the vocabulary.
The jargon is so thick, and it made me wonder, is this really what it takes to be reasonable, to have a reasonable opinion about the Shroud? Because what we just listened to between both Teddi and Hugh, I would not say that one was, more prepared than the other. They were both highly prepared for this conversation.
Yeah, they both did a good job.
Yeah, they did a great job. Great job, Teddi. I don't say that enough. But I think this was your best performance because you were talking gobbledygook that no one understands. When you talk about things people understand, it doesn't seem as great. But now you seem really, really in your territory there. So I do want to acknowledge that. But what I was saying is, honestly, if the average person is just trying to figure out whether belief in the Shroud is reasonable or not reasonable, what we just heard was, at the very least, an associate's level degree program. And we only dealt with the very tip of a very tiny iceberg.
This is the first fundamental objection that David Johnson raises here. It's basically one that I have received from him over and over again, totally, in my opinion, disingenuous, but it's too complicated. The average, quote-unquote, average person couldn't possibly understand this stuff and that sort of thing, blah, blah, blah. And if it's a theological objection. It's trying to say, look, if I have to get this level of knowledge, then God is unreasonable to expect me to have to learn all this stuff in order to come to faith in Christ. So God's not fair, therefore I'm justified in my non-belief. The typical objection of an atheist and skeptics that they always like to give here, and David Johnson in particular always gave when we were in Skeptics and Seekers: turn off your brain, it's too difficult, because David Johnson deems it unreasonable. So I'll just have to say this objection, let's start off on a positive note. So this objection, obviously, I think that, look, not everyone is a rocket scientist. Not everybody is a scientist. And there are elements when you get into nuclear engineering, nuclear physics, the chemistry, there are some technical things that you need to be able to learn. Now, can a normal, average, reasonable person learn them if they apply themselves? Yes, because that's what I am. That's what Teddi is. We're not scholars. We're not scientists. We're just average people, and I can tell you my eyes glaze over when I hear a lot of scientific mumbo-jumbo. But when I apply myself and read through it, and you're able to learn it. So if David Johnson or Darren Lute actually were interested in the truth, then they would be able to understand these things and apply themselves a little bit, and they'd be able to learn it. There's different presentations. Maybe he thinks that Teddi was a little too, and Hugh Farey were a little bit too technical. Later on in the show, he mentions me, that I'm not good at, dumbing things down for the average person or something. And I've had feedback on some of my shows. I'm not always the best at presenting it on a popular level. Even when I'm trying my best to do that, people will say sometimes, well, I just can't understand. It's too technical. It's too involved. But just because I or Teddi fail in that regards, there are other people that are good at presenting a popular level thing that people could understand. When I bring on Barry Schwartz, for example, the first time on the interview, all of the Fundy Lay skeptics from SNS were, wow, this is great, this is amazing. They were convinced, they were persuaded, they understood it. So there are different people that can present it to different audiences. It's unfair and uncharitable of David just to go, oh, well, because Dale and Teddi aren't good at presenting it to laymen or on a popular level, that therefore the average person is totally unable to access the evidence from the Shroud, and therefore God's responsible for that, for proving Christianity is true with such an inaccessible piece of evidence. Well, that's complete rubbish. And additionally, I also believe in elevating people. Again, that's a quote from David, that I'm sorry, you just need to be able to apply yourself. Be a real seeker. Actively seek, for goodness sakes. I mean, you guys are able to do that. David's kind of disingenuous here. He's not as dumb as he likes to pretend. He's dumb. He's the dumbest person alive when it's convenient for him. When it supports his point, oh, I can't get this. It's totally beyond me. And yet, here he is in other shows when it's convenient for him. All of a sudden, he understands the complex science of quantum physics and cosmology, and it's the Christians who don't get it. He gets the science. He's able to read physics textbooks and stuff like that. So you have to be able to spot that there's a little bit of disingenuousness with some of these skeptics. The truth is, look, they don't want to be able to get it, so they don't even try. They don't apply themselves. Just want to assume it's kookery. They want to assume it's false because that goes against what they want to. It goes against what they want to hear if it is in fact true. Scientific evidence proving that Christianity is true? Surely that can't be. That would destroy our atheist worldview. So that's what I believe. With these skeptics in particular, unlike Hugh Farey, who is a Shroud skeptic, but he's also a Christian, he's willing to put in the legwork. But there are other skeptics who are willing, on a lay level, average people that are willing to do some of the groundwork. But yeah, I just don't think that, unfortunately, neither David Johnson nor Darren Lute, from what I know of them, they just want to assert and assume the Shroud's a fake and have an easy way to just dismiss the evidence without having to look into it and seriously consider its merits. That's my honest assessment of this objection here. So yeah, is God on the hook, immorally putting people's eternal salvations on something that's just totally inaccessible to the average person? No. Total BS, total ridiculousness. Sorry, Shroud skeptics. Maybe you'll be better with your next objection. Let's hear what that is.
Yeah, well, I just want to hammer home the point. Whenever, because it's a theme of mine that comes up from time to time. When I was debating Dale every week, this was a theme that came up a lot. We all know that Dale's a very smart guy, and Dale does a lot of research, and it's very easy for Dale to start talking over you, over your head. Because he's going so deeply in it, and he doesn't realize it. I don't think he. Well, sometimes he probably does it on purpose, but I don't think he was trying to most of the time. And I think that he was doing his best to say, yes, well, this is complicated stuff, and I want to help elevate you, rather than he wasn't good at coming down to your level, but he did his best to try to bring us up to his level. But my complaint is, if this is the level you've got to get to understand it, I'm already out. I can't, especially with regard to the Shroud, because I've read a lot of Shroud stuff. I've watched a lot of Shroud videos. I've listened to a lot of discussions like this, and it all seems to be like this. And it just seems like, well, if this is the level that you've got to be in just to be in the conversation and have an opinion, you've already left most of us behind. Is that your experience, or is there another way to absorb the Shroud that's more of a Shroud for Dummies type level?
There's two answers to that. I mean, yes and no. If you want to get into the facts of the situation, you really do have to understand the science involved. And what's going on. And if you want to talk from a place of knowledge from everything that's going on, I mean, the Shroud does cover a lot of different scientific endeavors. And then there's also the fact that none of that really matters. None of the science, none of the details, none of them actually matter, because when you're when you're being asked to believe something, you are either believing it because of the facts actually represent what you're trying to prove. In this case, that the shroud is a supernatural thing, or they don't. But no one's ever been able to give a reliable method to actually demonstrate supernatural causation. It was like when you asked Teddi the question about what her idea is on how the shroud was made. Shroud authenticists, I'm not sure what the term they were using where there was, but anyways, those that promote the shroud as being authentic, they never provide a mechanism for how the shroud was created. They never they never demonstrate that the supernatural is real, that it's capable of producing a shroud. None of that. And so you have this situation where they're criticizing the science, that the science can't come up with a way that it could have been done naturally, but yet they can't come up with a way that it could have been done supernaturally either.
Well, that's one of the problems that I have with all this. So a lot of the Christians that I've been interacting with lately try to kind of move away from the nameless hand-wavy magic and say that God acts within nature. Mm-hmm. And so when a star forms, they don't say it's magic, as if they were a Bronze Age stargazer. They talk about the formation of stars and just talk about how God did his work through nature. And so I at least expect, the authenticists to have some kind of idea of the natural mechanism. So I at least appreciate the people who have the radiation theories, because at least they're talking a nature that we can understand.
Right, but when that happens, then they're also demonstrating that the shroud is not supernatural at the same time. Because if we can't find any natural mechanisms to create the shroud, and God works through natural mechanisms to create the shroud, then that's also using their logic that they're using. If we can't find a natural mechanism, then that's that rules out God too, if he's using natural mechanisms to create the shroud. So even if you take that approach to miracles, using the shroud proponent's logic, it completely discounts the shroud as being authentic.
Yeah, it's really hard for me to get on board with any explanation there's no explanation at all. It's just all hand wavy. Well, it's magic, is how it happened. And so that...
Okay, so this is the second major objection that these lay skeptics bring up against the Shroud of Turin. And it's actually twofold here. So the first part, and this is brought up by Darren Lute instead of David Johnson, Darren basically brings up this point. Well, look, they always, pro-Shroud proponents always just try to refute the naturalistic hypotheses. They never try to prove the supernatural ones or provide supernatural mechanisms of their own. And this is complete rubbish. Darren Lute is just ignorant, totally ignorant of Shroud research, and he shows himself to be such here. He must be confused. Sure, Teddi maybe didn't provide her own supernatural mechanism on the show with Hugh Farey. And I myself, in my approach, don't feel the need to have to come up with a supernatural explanation to explain the Shroud. I've told everybody what I believe. I'm along the lines of Bob Rucker and Mark Antonacci's historically consistent hypothesis. They do recommend particle radiation hypotheses, but we're not alone. Other pro-Shroud experts, as people will know from my interview with Teddi Pappas on the Complete Sinner's Guide the other day, Daniel Lowry, a friend of mine on the and who's very knowledgeable about the Shroud, he brought up the VUV hypothesis of Dr. John Jackson, where ultraviolet radiation of some sort is responsible for the images. Is it gamma ray particles? Is it things? Giulio Fanti has the corona discharge. That's another supernatural mechanism proposed. The formation of the image is supernatural, and then the natural mechanisms take over and respond accordingly with these mechanisms. So we do provide supernatural proposals. Just because I don't feel the need to do that necessarily, and or Teddi doesn't mean that other Pro-Shroud people haven't. They've done it in great detail and proven scientifically and mathematically that if these mechanisms were to operate, they would explain all of the data better than all other naturalistic hypotheses in terms of radiation from within a body. For example, it fulfills everything. Not only that, they're following the scientific method. They've provided detailed scientific predictions that will prove in as Mark Antinacci says, a dispositive way, conclusively, 100%. We'll have Richard Dumboy Dawkins believing in the Shroud of Turin. If we can do some further non-invasive scientific tests on the Shroud of Turin. Not only can we prove that cloth was irradiated with neutrons, for example, leading to the erroneous carbon-14 dates, we can prove the images were formed through particle radiation. Zero doubt, scientifically proven fact, as certain as the Earth is round. So we don't only just come up with explanations that fit the data better than all other naturalistic explanations. So already Darren's lying. We do propose supernatural mechanisms in detail, scientific detail, published in peer-reviewed journals. We also go beyond that and provide precise predictions that will, in a dispositive manner, prove that this supernatural mechanism actually took place. And you can check that out in Mark Antinacci's new book, Test the Shroud at the Atomic and Molecular Levels. He's got at least 2 appendixes giving precise predictions, scientific predictions, which follows the logical, valid deductive form of denying the consequent. We can provide Modus Tollens arguments that prove radiation from a body created those images if the Catholic Church will just let us do those tests. And again, these guys aren't alone. Bob Rucker on his website provides various things. He's got articles testing the neutron absorption hypothesis, his explanation for the carbon dating. He gives precise, specific, and quantitative predictions as to what we will find if his hypothesis is true. We can falsify it right now. So Darren just doesn't know what he's talking about. But we'll get into that. Again, I don't personally get too much into detail into this. I do assess, when I get into my future solo shows, I will provide more detail. I never answer Daniel Lowry straight out. I always try to evade the question a little bit, and my apologies for that. And it's because I'm saving for my solo show, once I get to some of these radiation hypotheses, such as the ultraviolet, De Lazaro and Jackson hypothesis versus more of the particle radiation of Antinacci and Bob Rucker. I'll provide more details as to why I favor one over the other. I've just learned in experience, don't get into those details until I've done the solo show, because skeptics will latch on to any easy excuse if I just give an off-the-cuff answer rather than giving my detailed one. So I always try to wait on that stuff. But yeah, so anyways, in terms of Darren's objection, total nonsense. But next, the more fundamental objection, this is something I've heard from skeptics all the time, is that you have to prove the supernatural. You're proposing a supernatural event. No, we're not. I don't suppose a supernatural event. I know I use the word for simplicity in my Shroud solo series all the time and in my debates, and I have to do that for simplicity's sake. But as Bob Rucker, he emailed me recently about my thing with direct contact. I just gave an example of one supernatural mechanism to explain the bloodstains, and he said, well, hey, you're missing another supernatural thing, a radiation pulse, which I'll explain it more. I'll go over his comment and read it out in my next Shroud solo show, and just for the audience. But and I kind of responded to him, and he was trying to say in that comment that, well, look, this is natural law. This is a radiation pulse of the bloodstains being pulsed out onto the cloth itself. This is perfectly natural. This was what would happen if this event happened, this neutron flux or the proton flux hypothesis. The body disappeared in a femtosecond, and these things, particles were unleashed onto the cloth. And this is just what would happen naturally. Scientific laws prove that this would happen. And, Bob was kind of saying, well, look, who cares about the supernatural stuff? You don't need to call it supernatural. It's purely natural. We know this would happen if this event took place. And my thing is kind of saying, well, look, a radiation from within a human body is by definition supernatural. So I have no problem as a Christian using the word supernatural. I believe in supernatural events and that sort of thing. However, when you're dealing with a skeptic, especially like Darren Lute and David Johnson, and I know from shows, we've done shows on the miracles, they tend to think this supernatural thing is an actual category of events that hasn't been demonstrated to exist. And on that basis, they just dismiss anything that claims to be supernatural. And I think that's totally wrong-headed. And it's for this reason that I actually agree with Bob. Despite my terminology in my Shroud solo shows, I'm not trying to argue that Shroud was formed supernaturally. I believe it would be if we could prove something like radiation from the body, that's supernatural. But regardless of whether it's supernatural or not, a natural anomaly is good enough. I don't care. The point is, this whole supernatural versus natural divide that came about only in the 1700s is ridiculous nonsense. These are categories or labels we've placed on to events. So really, we need to look at the Shroud of Turin from the lens of intelligent design. And we do have, it's a scientifically proven fact, we have intelligent agents, human beings, who are proven to design events all the time. So all we have to do is prove that the Shroud of Turin's image formation was designed by an intelligent agent, and through my 11 premise argument and fulfilling my criteria for being a G-belief authenticating event, we can prove that that agent was God, and he designed this event to authenticate the Christian religion. And this totally bypasses this supernatural versus natural nonsense that Darren Lute brings out. We don't have to prove that there's supernatural events that take place. All we have to prove is, look, there are intelligent agents that design events to happen. This is an explanatory option on the table. Again, presuming we've proven God exists and is an intelligent agent. That's premise 1 of my 11 premise argument. So not part of my Shroud solo show, but it is part of the assumed background knowledge that I prove in premise 1 prior to getting to this stuff in premise 11 of my argument, where I actually provide the evidence for Christianity and that God has designed certain events like the formation of the Shroud images to authenticate that Christianity is true. There's events that happen with great frequency, great high probabilities they happen. Those are natural laws. Then there are events that happen with intermediate probabilities. Let me say this again. So there's high frequency events, high probability events. These are accomplished through natural law. Near 100%, they will always happen every time. Then there are intermediate probabilities. These are usually ascribed to random chance or coincidence and that sort of thing. Then there are small probabilities or small frequency events. These can either be ascribed to random chance or coincidence or to intelligent design. And when we have intelligent design involved, so in addition to the small probability, we have a specification, a specified pattern that the event itself adheres to, and which the pattern is independent of the event's occurrence. That's what William Dembski calls specified complexity. If we have that, that proves an intelligent agent did it. And this happens all the time. We always are able to detect intelligent design in this way. This is uncontroversial science. So Darren is just plain wrong. We can prove, in my case, I'm proving that the Shroud is an extraordinary artifact. And I'm go through various arguments to do that based on its uniqueness, despite sufficient opportunity for duplication, as well mechanistic arguments. So right now in my Shroud solo series, I'm on the first argument, the mechanistic type arguments in terms of the body and bloodstain images, and I'm proving that no ordinary naturalistic mechanisms are able to explain the Shroud's images, and therefore it's an extraordinary image. So my distinction is between extraordinary mechanisms versus ordinary mechanisms. Extraordinary mechanisms might be supernatural. It doesn't have to be. Maybe they're natural. Maybe God used natural mechanisms to create an event that is still outside of our ordinary, well-established, and currently well-understood scientific knowledge at this given time. And again, that criterion is relative to whatever time. The standards change depending on what time you're there, because God does signs at various times in human history and that sort of thing. So that all we're trying to prove is that it's extraordinary and therefore improbable given ordinary naturalistic mechanisms. And then finally, the third criterion is that there's a religious context it takes place in. That provides the specification, whereby God, this event is attached to a religious message. It serves to attest to the truth or to authenticate that religious message. And the event isn't subsumable to authenticating any other religious message that contradicts the original religious message that claimed this event or that sort of thing. If you have those three elements, I have a method. It's positive set of criteria that correspond to specified complexity, a set of scientifically proven criteria that prove inductively and allow us to infer intelligent design and intelligent agency that we use all the time. And again, I've done shows on my miracles, on my miracle solo show. Go check that out, where I detail this in absolute with rigorousness and that sort of thing. So yeah, Darren's just lying. Whenever a skeptic says, oh, these Christians are just giving an argument from ignorance, they don't know how to explain it, they disprove all the natural mechanisms, therefore God, that's not what we're doing. I have a detailed set of positive criteria. It's based on what we know positively that allows us to say God did that. God created those images because it's an intelligently designed event. Designed by who? Well, my criteria identify the agent as God. For what purpose? My criteria allow us for the purpose of authenticating the religious message of Christianity. So yeah, it's on the basis of what we know positively that I, at least, will be making my Shroud argument. Disqualifying the various ordinary naturalistic mechanisms, that's just a part of my case. I don't just establish that and go, therefore God. No, that's one criterion, sub-criterion in my overall case. It's everything, the conjunction of all my criteria together that warrants the conclusion God did it. And Darren's without excuse. He knows this. He was been a fan. He's listened to every show, and he's heard my Miracles solo show where I outline this, and I've told him in the comments. So his saying this at this point is just disingenuous on his part. Again, I have to be fair. He is responding to Teddi specifically, but he doesn't limit what he says to Teddi only. In this debate, he says all Christians or Shroud proponents are like this. So he falls prey to my criticism. He should know better. We're not giving an argument from ignorance, nor are we arguing that just because ordinary naturalistic mechanisms fail, therefore God did it, or therefore a supernatural event must have took place. So yeah, that's the second objection there. Let's move on.
I had written down 3 notes, and then I had written a number 4, and I just let it sit there for for like an hour and a half because I gave up. But my questions were really simplistic that I wanted to go back to. So the first one, my objection in the opening argument. I'm fine that they are both on the same page with that, but I just wanted to revisit it for a moment because as someone who used to care about the theology anyway, that explanation would have never flown. It wouldn't have flown in my church. It wouldn't have flown in my days as a theist. That, well, John just made it up. I mean, I think I recall Hugh saying, "Yeah, John wasn't there. He's no eyewitness. I don't think he knew what he was talking about. He just made it up." And I think you sacrifice too much there, because from my perspective, if I am a Bible-centric believer who's trying to wrap my mind around the shroud, and in the first 10 minutes, the Christians are saying, John guy just made it up, I don't think that would speak to me at all at that point.
Yeah, I've never actually understood that line of argument from Christians. Because if John just made it up, then you don't have any indication that John knew anything more than Mark or Paul or any of these other guys that wrote the Bible. So if John just made it up, then why didn't the rest of them just make it up too?
I mean, why wouldn't we believe any other shroud stories in the Bible? If that one, and by the way, John is a fairly sacred book for Christians. Oftentimes, they will use John as the book for, if you're looking into Christianity, just read the book of John. It's a very sacred book, and it is sacred even among the Gospels. And to just kind of throw John away, just throw John under the bus for this one thing, what would it have happened had the shroud of Turin, looked more like John's depiction, several strips and then a face covering? Then what would we have said about the other descriptions then in the Bible? It seems to be an unsalvageable position the moment you say that the most reliable gospel writer and most beloved of the gospel writers just made the story up. Because now you ask about the other Gospels. Well, what about the shroud itself then? What about the legends of the shroud? Maybe they're just making it up too, or just trying to follow whichever of the Gospel writers they thought was more reliable. I mean, once we introduce the man of God who wrote the fourth book of the New Testament made it up, I don't even know what we're talking about anymore.
Yeah. Well, and it's not really an argument that can be disputed either, because there is no methodology around for Christians to figure out which parts of the Bible are true and which aren't. So, I mean, once you start realizing that some parts of the Bible are just made up, then you don't have any way to stem that tide. And so you either have to do what the fundamentalists do and believe that it is completely the Word of God and everything of it is true and the earth is 6,000 years old, or you're stuck with trying to figure out which parts of it are accurate and which part aren't without any methodology to reliably distinguish fact from fiction.
Right. Well, and that's fine. They're middle grounds that one can take, but once you go all the way to they just made it up so that you can have this one thing, I think you've given up the game early on for a lot of people that would be listening to this and would maybe be hanging on the edge of their seats, but I think they would check out. I mean, I know that every member of the denomination that I was a part of, had they been listening to the program, they would have checked out at that point, because they would have said, "No, you can't just accuse writers of the Bible of just bald-faced lying about stuff."
So this was the objection. This was actually an objection brought up right at the beginning of the debate between Teddy and Hugh that I posted last week that you can listen to, based on the Gospel of John. So Teddy and I kind of addressed this in the show. Obviously, David is taking issue with Hugh Farey's response, not the response that Teddy gave, but that Hugh Farey gave, where he just said, well, I think The person who wrote the Gospel of John is John the Elder. That's not necessarily John the Apostle, the guy who looked in the tomb. So he thinks that John the Elder is just making it all up. Obviously, David takes issue with that. I agree with him. I don't believe that myself. That's an answer particular to Hugh. Although I am partial to the fact that I don't think the Gospel of John might have been written by John the Elder rather than John the Apostle. I like Richard Bauckham's argumentation on that front, but I also think that there's some good arguments proving that it was John the Apostle. So I can see it both ways. But nonetheless, I do not agree with his assessment that John was making it all up. So in the first place, we have to address David Johnson's fundamental false assumption here. Let's assume that John's gospel is true. That's what Teddy was arguing, unlike Hugh Farey. And it mentions strips. It's different than the word used in the synoptic gospels, which obviously means a sindon, a sheet, and that sort of thing. Well, both Hugh and Teddy agreed that strips in the ancient Koine Greek world of the Roman Empire meant things as wide as sails, which would include the Shroud of Turin as a burial shroud, and thin strips, anything in between. So a burial shroud counts as a strip. And we know from what we said, look, there's at least four things. There was a chin strap. There was also a thin strap that was wrapped around. Then there was the burial shroud. And there was the sudarium of Oviedo, the head cloth that covered Jesus' thing, which was over on the side. So there was at least four strips or cloths. Gospels confirm. There's no problem with the Gospel of John. David Johnson just hasn't bothered to even look at what the Pro-Shroud proponents have to say. He just did quick Google search. This must be must be an objection because I've seen Shroud skeptics on the internet going after it. He hasn't bothered to do his research. But again, in defense, Hugh's answer wasn't that great. His answer is John made it up. Well, that's not. I can understand his problems with that, but we don't have to resort to that. No, the Gospel of John is perfectly consistent with what we have with the Shroud of Turin, where that strip was ripped off and used to tie and bind Jesus in the Koine Greek, bind or tie, and then it was sewn back onto the shroud subsequent to it. So there's no inconsistency here. And David Johnson's operating upon this weird assumption that multiple strips, it's like an old-fashioned ancient Egyptian mummy. Well, to that, I'm just going to quote my good friend, Pro-Shroud expert Barry Schwartz, who's a Jew, in his article, 5 Reasons Why Christians Reject the Shroud or something, or object to the Shroud, and he refutes this nonsense. Look, maybe David Johnson forgets or doesn't know his Roman history. Even the Egyptians had stopped mummifying their dead in this way with small little hundreds and hundreds of strips, small little strips bounding up the bodies and stuff. Nobody buried their dead that way in Jesus' day. So he's just ignorant of the history. So what's next?
Yeah, so as much as I would love to chase that, because this is a topic that I do understand, let me just move to the next note that I had taken. There was no mention of the shroud in the Bible or in early history, and this also bothers me about the shroud. So the reason I was asking about other shrouds, I mean, we should have many shrouds, burial shrouds, and I've never heard of another burial shroud with an image on it. So that said, if normal burial shrouds don't get images like this, and the one that Jesus was wrapped in did get this image, then that should have been the talk of the town. There should have been 10 more chapters at the end of each gospel because of the shroud, and yet it is not mentioned. And so, to me, I know some will immediately say, "Well, the absence of evidence is not the evidence of absence," but it is the evidence of absence when you would expect a certain result, when you have reason to expect that it would be there. And I think that we have good reason to expect that it would be there if this was truly a unique property that proved that Jesus rose from the dead. So I know that each side gave their answers, but I'm stuck on that point, and I can't find a way to get past it.
Well, I would imagine as the Christians get it past the same way they get past all the raised dead and the temple wall coming asunder and then magically fixing itself right afterwards, and all the other, star that actually came down into Earth's orbit to shine the way and yet somehow didn't incinerate the planet.
Right, but at least all of those stories have in common that they were mentioned in the Bible. So they were made up by someone from an ancient time. The Shroud story wasn't even made up then. So some of that you can say, well, there's only one mention of the Bible. That seems weird. But for the Shroud image, there's 0 mentions in the Bible. So I'm sorry, I can't get past it. And for those who are listening, maybe you can help me get past that. But as I was listening to the conversation, I was just trying to hear something that would make me get past these first couple of things, and nothing was said. I'll give you the last one on my list.
Okay, so how do we respond to this objection? The Shroud isn't mentioned in the Bible. Typical Fundy-Lay skeptic objection to the Shroud of Turin. David tries to come up with a straw man argument. Well, the absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence, and he responds by saying, yes, but we would expect the evidence in this case. So in this case, it is evidence of absence. Total rubbish. He has no clue how to establish this. He can't prove that we would have an expectation of this mention at all. It's just total historical rubbish. And, Dr. McGrew, Lydia and Tim McGrew have done lots of work on calibrating our expectations. Atheists just utterly fail, like David Johnson. They cannot prove that we would historically expect a mention in the Bible of the Shroud of Turin, even if it had images on it. But let's assume for the sake of argument that he's correct. Well, first response. It is mentioned in the Bible, David. Oops, you didn't know that, did you? There are Pro-Shroud experts and biblical scholars who argue that it is mentioned in the biblical book of Galatians, chapter 3, verse 1. It says, "O foolish Galatians, who has bewitched you? It was before your eyes that Jesus Christ was publicly portrayed as crucified." Publicly portrayed as crucified? How could that possibly be? They saw the shroud. They saw Jesus' images on the Shroud of Turin. That's how. So, boom, it's in the biblical book of Galatians. You're wrong. You should have done your studies, David. Instead of being lazy and just believing what you find out on an skeptical internet or infidels.org, you should have researched what the Pro-Shroud experts were actually saying. Now, to be fair, despite my emphasis on that, there is scholarly debate, and most biblical scholars don't believe that this is, in fact, a reference to the Shroud of Turin. David doesn't have a clue about that, of course, but it's important. There's debate. There's debate here, and this could be. What is he talking about? What do you mean? What do you mean that Jesus was crucified before the Jews, not the Galatians? So how did the Galatians have a public portrayal of Jesus crucified before them? What is that talking about? There's various interpretations of that, one of which is a plausible one, that they saw the Shroud of Turin with the images on it. Again, I think that's improbable as a reading, but it's out there among some Shroud scholars. Okay, so if it's not mentioned then, and we would have this expectation, as David said, let's grant everything for the sake of argument, why isn't it mentioned in the Bible? Isn't this proof that there was no Shroud images? Well, here's the answer that I take. Yes, you're right. There were no Shroud images. Huh? David Johnson would probably say. Well, look, if a radiation hypothesis is explaining the Shroud's body images, well, then all that would be on the Shroud would be blood stains. The body images would take time to develop, decades or even centuries, as some people have calculated, depending on the level of radiation, that it would take for the images to darken and yellow and degrade the cellulose to the point where they were visible. So, for example, with particle radiation or UV radiation, think about it. When you put your newspaper out in the sunlight and it's exposed to ultraviolet radiation, it doesn't your paper doesn't instantly turn yellow, does it? It's not instantly visible. It stays white. It takes time for the pages to age and turn yellow. And again, depending on the levels of radiation, it's been calculated it could take decades, several decades, even up to multiple centuries after the fact for the body images to turn up and become visible to the naked human eye. That's why the Bible didn't mention them. Does David know that? Well, he should, because I addressed this objection in some of my Shroud solo shows, but of course it goes over his head because, oops, that would be a credible answer to an objection that would mean I would have to not object to the Shroud. I don't want to believe in the Shroud, so I just pretend I didn't hear it and keep going on with the same objections over and over again. That's what these skeptics do. So yeah, this objection is just nonsense. It's been refuted, and there's been various ways to address it. There's zero provable expectation that we would expect the Shroud of Turin to be mentioned in the Bible. All right, so let's move on to their next objection. Let's hopefully they come up with something that's worthy here of the pro-Shroud experts and Shroud scholars who've done their research. Something that shows that they've actually considered and put some thought into their objections. All right, let's see what they've got.
Oh, yeah. It was Bishop Darcy, ? So, I don't know how much you know about Bishop Darcy or if it's necessary to know a lot about Bishop Darcy, but he's the guy who was saying the Shroud was fake early on, and I think that Hugh made a very compelling case. They all thought it was fake. And Teddi, her only response to that was they were being political. They had their internal political reasons for not promoting the Shroud. But to me, that is the same as saying they believed it was fake. Because if it doesn't matter what internal political reason you have, if you honestly have the image of Christ on a burial cloth and you could prove it, and you thought that was the case, you would say so.
Yeah, the problem with that kind of logic is that you get into conspiracy thinking, and there's no way to defend against conspiracy thinking, because no matter what you say, no matter what happens, it all is proof that the conspiracy happened. And you have to remember that the Middle Ages, there were like 12 or 13 foreskins of Jesus rolling around in the Middle Ages. I think the Catholic Church has like 3 or 4 of them.
Maybe he was well endowed. Took a few cuts.
Yeah, maybe. But 12 foreskins worth? I'm dubious at best. And I think the Catholic Church has like 3 or 4 of them. So it's not like that medieval forgeries weren't prevalent at the time. So to think that this was a medieval forgery was probably the default position of anyone in the church, just because they were just so prevalent in the Middle Ages. And I'm not entirely sure that because they thought it was a forgery that's really a compelling argument.
But what would need to be added to that is the something that happened later that made them change their mind. Because they knew it was a forgery, at least in their minds, they knew it was a forgery, and yet they didn't destroy it. They continue to use it and keep it for their own purposes.
Oh yeah, the Catholic Church is very good at that. They will keep known forgeries all the time because it brings in people, and they pretty much, in their writings, they pretty much say that.
Right, and so I never heard anything that made me get over that hump. The people who had it at its earliest thought it was crap, and I will continue to believe that from not just this discussion but other things that I've read. They didn't buy it, and you can say, well, okay, they were wrong about it, but they kept it and they used it even though they knew at least in their minds, they knew it was a forgery. And so I can never trust anything from that source that then might turn around and say, oh, no, mea culpa. Not a forgery at all. Real thing. Keep sending money. Keep touring our city. I can never trust that at that point. And so you might say, well, it's not epistemically justifiable to say, well, just because they didn't believe it doesn't mean it's true. But I would also say that because they didn't believe it, it means that I don't have a good reason to believe it either.
Yeah, I guess it depends on whether we've got good documentation that they actually examined it before making their decision about it. And that also assumes that they have a reliable means to distinguish a real artifact from a fake one. And we also know that they were perfectly fine touting forgeries, showing off forgeries to bring people into the religion. So,
so why should we start believing it was not a forgery? I mean, that's, and you know the history of the Shroud better than I do. I mean, what is the big turning point in history that makes you think, okay, the Catholic Church knew it was a forgery, they knew it was a forgery, they were using it cynically, and then, oh, wait a minute, this happened, now we should take more notice of it?
I don't think there was really any one thing that did it. I think you get enough people believing it that it's real, and eventually that's just sort of the bubble that you exist in.
Right, but we know that people started believing that it was real because of a lie. So, once again, maybe it is real, but I would say that its providence is so murky at this point. I don't think that I could ever be convinced of it. If the way it got its start was as a fraud, it's like any fraud today. The old Egyptian prince who has a fortune and just needs to launder it to the U.S. or somehow, and you just need to send him enough money to get it out of that, whatever the scam is of the week. That might be true. So one of those may have been true at some point. As many times have been done. Who knows? But we have no good reason to ever believe it.
Well, yeah, but I feel the same way about religion too. So,
right. So I'm just saying, even if there happens to be a legitimate Ethiopian prince who wants to send email out to people to get help, I would say that card has been played already. And he's going to have to come up with something else besides a story, because it is at this point legitimate to disbelieve it, just prima facie.
Right, so there's a couple issues here that I want to address. So let's start with the fact that, okay, in the medieval period, there was a whole bunch of fake relics, and let's just assume for the sake of argument that there are a whole bunch of fakes. I think that's true. I'm a Protestant, and I think even Catholics admit there's a whole bunch of fakes. I had Dr. Cheryl White on my show. She's a committed Catholic, devout Catholic. And she's a medieval historian and world's expert in this area specifically. And even she admits there was lots and lots of fake relics that existed at this time. Now, in the first place, does this prove that you're reasonable to automatically disbelieve the Shroud because there are so many fakes? No. That's illogical and irrational skeptics, because you're committing the guilt by association fallacy, whereby someone or something, like the Shroud of Turin, a relic, is associated in some way with another type of thing, and therefore, the Shroud. So the Shroud is associated as a relic, and it's associated with other things that are relics. Those relics are fake, therefore the Shroud must be fake. That is irrational. That is a logical fallacy. Darren Lute should be ashamed of himself for even bringing up this argument. It creates the lower probability of it doesn't lower the prior probability at all. Only a fool would think that this is how you statistically calculate prior probabilities and automatically assume the shroud's a fake because there are so many other things that are fakes. You know, it's as dumb as saying there's no real money because there's a lot of counterfeit money out there and stuff like that. Obviously, there's some technicalities and nuance here. You have to show that it would be, in a nuanced way, it would share the relevant feature of being fake for some reason. So there's a lot of argumentation that these skeptics don't even bother going in, and therefore they are committing the guilt by association fallacy. You know, it's kind of like saying, well, all of the Roman buildings we found date from the 1st century, so therefore it's very highly improbable a priori. You should just disbelieve that the Romans built buildings prior. You know, we discover a new building, or like the sewers, Cloaca Maxima, or whatever it's called, or something. Oh, well, that must have been built in the 1st century AD too, because all of the buildings we've discovered up to this point date from the 1st century AD. So statistically, this must have been. No, that's not the way logic works. No historian in their right mind would be so stupid as to reason in that way. And it's because they're not relevantly similar to make that association and ascribe all properties of these buildings in this hypothetical scenario, and then say that, oh, well, this structure also shares that. No, that's guilt by association. You can't do that. So yeah, there's that right away. Foolish mistake by these lay skeptics. But more importantly, they bring up Bishop Darcy's memorandum. So fans of my show will remember I went into exquisite detail destroying and refuting this nonsense of an alleged evidence that the shroud is a proven medieval artistic fake and that there was an inquiry. Let me just address it very quickly for you guys here and now. You can get the full details of my debate with Alan in Shroud Wars Round 1 on my Real Seekers YouTube page, or go to my blog page where I lay out the case and provide scholarly level sources all about this Bishop memorandum by actual historians, PhD historians, secular historians, all refuting this nonsense, proving that the memorandum's garbage. In fact, Hugh Farey himself, in a later show on my the show he did a debate with Dr. Cheryl White, that medieval historian, even he poo-pooed on the memorandum of Bishop Darcis at that time, later time, after this debate with Teddy, saying, well, it's not really that good evidence, actually. No, let's not use that. That doesn't prove anything. So even Hugh Farey, if I'm remembering properly, out of fairness to him, and if I'm not, I'm sure he'll let us know in the comments, but this evidence is garbage. So yeah, go to my Shroud Wars Round 1 to see my refutation of it in the YouTube video, and or even better, go to my blog, Shroud Wars Round 1, and look at the sources, the scholarly sources I provide refuting this, several sources from scholars and historians, and or check out the debate between Cheryl White and Hugh Farey on my YouTube page there. So what is this memorandum by Bishop Darcis? What is David talking about here? Well, essentially in the year 1389, or some historians say the year 1390, a memorandum was written by a guy named Bishop Pierre Darcis in France. And he wrote this letter allegedly or memorandum to the Pope, complaining. He was a little complaining about a church in Liry, France, a small little church in Liry, France that was outside of his control. And he was complaining about the Shroud of Turin, the object of the Shroud of Turin, because they were making money from pilgrims coming. So that kind of refutes already what Darren Lute was saying, that it took time for them to make money. No, they were making money right from the beginning, so that wasn't a motive for the change in opinion. Darren just doesn't know the history at all. But anyways, what does the memorandum say? Well, it alleges, in a sense, I'll read it in a second, but it essentially alleges, look, 40 years ago, the former bishop of this place, my successor, Bishop Henry de Poitiers, or Henry of Poitiers, conducted an investigation, an official inquiry into the Shroud of Turin at this little church, And he found out the artist came and confessed to him that it was all fake, and he artistically created this shroud so that the church could make money. So let's read what it actually says. This is, quote unquote, one translation reads, quote unquote, about 1355 to 1356, the church at Leary procured a cloth on which, in a subtle manner, was depicted a twofold image, which was falsely declared to be the actual burial shroud of Jesus. This was done to procure money, or out of avarice, which just means greed, according to this Bishop Pierre d'Arcis, from the multitudes attracted to the church. At the time, Bishop Henry de Poitiers of Troyes held an inquest at which an unnamed artist stated it had been manually depicted. This resulted in Henry ordering its removal from the church. Whoa. Shroud skeptics have got something here. It's pretty interesting. Does this prove the shroud's a fake? No, let's look into the details and be credible historians here. So, in the first place, just assessing, these funny skeptics, shroud skeptics like David Johnson and Darren Lute, because I know them specifically, they are hypocrites. Because why? They're talking about how, this is the earliest evidence, we just got to mindlessly believe it. It definitely makes you rational in believing it. Well, according to them, they rationally just believe everything in the Gospel of Mark. Why? Because this memorandum was written in 1389 or 1390, 40 years exactly after the events in 1355. He's allegedly saying this took place in 1355. That's about 40 years after the fact. The Gospel of Mark was written 40 years after Jesus died and rose on the dead, according to most biblical scholars, credible biblical scholars, atheist, agnostic, whatever it is. So I guess these skeptics just mindlessly believe that Jesus was real. Who cares about the shroud? They believe the Gospel of Mark. They believe Jesus was God in the flesh. He died and rose from the dead. And yes, I know the Gospel of Mark doesn't record resurrection appearances, but it does imply them. That's obvious. Every biblical scholar who's credible believes that. Jesus' miracles, he walked on water. He did all these supernatural miracles. Surely these skeptics just believe this document, right? From 40 years later. No, of course they don't. So they're being hypocrites and just mindlessly believing this medieval bishop, a Christian. Don't they tell us? David and Darren tell us how Christians are liars through the centuries. They make stuff up. But not this bishop. He's telling us atheists what we want to hear. He's against the Shroud of Turin. So he's telling the truth. Come on, you can't be a hypocrite here. You got to assess things critically. You can't just assume, this document helps the atheists and the shroud skeptics, so it's true. The Gospel of Mark, that supports the Christians. That's false. No, we got to do some historical investigation. And thankfully, PhD historians and credible scholars do have ways of evaluating historical documents to find out if the information that they have is reliable. So in the first place, we have the bibliographical test, which tells us do we have the original autograph? If not, how many manuscripts of the original autographs do we have? Copies of that original document? And how close are those copies or manuscripts in relation to the time of the original autograph? Secondly, we have the internal evidence test. So this is looking at evidence from the content of the document itself and making determinations on its reliability on that basis. And finally, we have the external evidence test. So this is based on relevant external factors or circumstances that possibly or speak to the reliability of the content in the document. So that's how we're going to evaluate this memorandum by Bishop d'Arcis. All right, so let's start with the bibliographical test. So in the first place, this is more internal evidence test, actually, this part. But look, all the extant copies, meaning all the copied manuscripts of the memo, we do not have the original autographs. Those are lost. But of all the manuscript extant copies that we still exist today of the memo, they are all unsigned, undated rough drafts with words marked for deletion, and they have the word in Latin, quote unquote, vacat, in the margins, which means vacate. All the other external documents that we'll look at when we get to the external evidence test, they, on the other hand, are all duly signed and dated and given official status. So what's the problem here? Look, no properly sealed copy of this memo has ever been discovered in either Avignon or in the secret archives of the Vatican. No document of anti-Pope Clement refers to it at all. And this suggests that it was never received, nor was it ever even sent in the first place. So Bishop Darcis never sent this memorandum to anybody because he knew it was complete historical horse trash and that he was a liar. But nonetheless, we know for sure it's not dated, not signed. It was never sent nor received by the Pope. We have no proof, and the proof says that it wasn't sent. We just have rough drafts that he was writing, allegedly unsigned, and deletions all over the place. And there's no mention of it and or record of this memo in Avignon or in the Vatican. Moreover, there's no mention of this memo in any of the known documents of Pope Clement VII either, about a previous communication with the bishop about the shroud and or its exhibition at all. Oops. Big problem, shroud skeptics. But it gets even worse for you people. So what's, in terms of the manuscripts, what are the earliest that we have? The ones that date back earliest in terms of the original autographs, going back to 1389. Well, essentially they are preserved in the Bibliothèque Nationale of Paris, France, and it possesses 2 copies of the memorandum labeled Folio 137 and Folio 138. Neither of these is dated, although historians estimate that these are probably the earliest based on appearance and that sort of thing. One of these folios is complete, the other is incomplete. Again, another rough draft apparently. Folio 138 is heavily edited and marked as first draft with underlinings. Some parts are entirely crossed out and some violent expressions are canceled. It's totally unsigned, it's undated, and even unaddressed to its intended recipient, which was apparently the Pope, according to the Shroud skeptics. But the complete one, the best one, Folio 137. Well, in the first place, it's not really fair to call this a document. This is the one that Shroud skeptics use the most to prove their case. But this document, Folio 137, doesn't even exist as a real document in the first place. It's actually a combination of 2 totally separate documents and a conflation of that. So the reason this is done is that Folio 137 is the needed document, but the heading claims it wasn't an official letter sent to the Pope. So this causes a problem for the Shroud skeptics. And in order to get it sent to the Pope, they need to combine it with a second document. So that's a little bit of fudging from Shroud skeptics in history, in later history, to try to make this argument work. Additionally, Folio 137 is unsigned and undated. Even more significantly, that the heading of the copy in the Bibliothèque Nationale de Paris in Champagne 154, Folio 137, it describes this as a letter Darcis, quote-unquote, intends to write, but didn't write and send out. Interesting. The textual or manuscript evidence clearly suggests that Bishop Darcis never completed nor ever sent this memo to the Pope in the first place. Furthermore, it wasn't addressed to the Pope. We don't know if it was even supposed to go to him. We don't know if Bishop Darcis himself ever signed. He didn't sign this. We don't know if he ever approved this. It could have just been written by a scribe for editing and that sort of thing. Again, there's no signing by Bishop Darcis himself. Okay, another issue here in terms of manuscript evidence. So there's no trace of mention in this memo that's found in a book called the Promptarium Tricassinae Diocese. So this is of the canon written by a guy named Nicholas Camusat. He was an assiduous collector and historian of the ancient archives of this Diocese of Troyes, where Bishop Pierre Darcis lived. He lived in around the 1600s, the early 17th century AD. And he is an extensive historian. He mentions everything. We would definitely expect him to mention this memo if it ever truly existed. And he expressly wrote of the Leary Church. He expressly wrote of Bishop Henry de Poitiers. He was the bishop predecessor that supposedly had this investigation into the shroud, according to the quote-unquote lying Bishop Pierre d'Arcis. He wrote about the bishop who approved the activities of Geoffrey I. He wrote of Bishop Pierre d'Arcis. And he wrote about Bishop Pierre d'Arcis's dispute with Geoffrey II de Charny, the owner of the shroud in Leary, who put it on display. But yet, for some reason, Camusset totally neglects to mention any transcription of this memorandum that the Shroud skeptics like to tell us about. Could it be that it's because there was no memorandum that was ever sent? At best, it was only ever a rough draft, but it was never sent in a final form to anyone. That's why Nicholas Camusset had no clue about it. Again, despite talking about Bishop Henry de Poitiers and this dispute about the shroud, no mention by Nicholas Camusset about an inquiry where an artist confessed that the shroud was a fake and that sort of thing, as the memo purports. Interesting. We would expect Camusset to mention that if there was any historical validity to that. That's more of an external evidence test type consideration. But nonetheless, it also speaks to the historicity of the text as well. No mention of it. Not looking too good for you, Shroud skeptics. Why wouldn't Bishop Pierre d'Arcis, why would he only write a rough draft that was heavily edited, never signed, never dated, never officialized or sent out in the first place? Because he was lying. It was historical horse trash, and he knew it, and he didn't want to send it out. That's probably why. That explains it. All right, but let's probe back even further here. Some of the internal aspects of this document. It's been noted by world's experts. For example, Dr. Eschbach remarks, looking at the nature of the writing, it is, quote-unquote, a rough draft. It is of such a faulty style that one could just not possibly, any medieval scholar with any ounce of knowledge could not possibly attribute this to an episcopal pen. Meaning Bishop d'Arcis didn't write this. It was written by some scribe, know-nothing scribe. He was probably told by Bishop d'Arcis, I'll get into his motivation, but, I want to stick it to those church at Leary and Geoffrey de Charny. They're getting all these pilgrims to give them money from the shroud. I want that money. I'm a greedy bugger. Write something, scribe, to go after them that I can send to the Pope and call it a fake and all this stuff. And the scribe did his best, but it was total garbage, written like a fool. And that's what this historian, world's expert today is saying, Dr. Eschbach. And then when Bishop d'Arcis saw it, he's like, I can't send this to the Pope. It's full of lies. It's just horribly written. So he never signed it, never dated it. That makes sense. That's probably what happened. That's what Dr. Eschbach is saying here. He's saying, look, it never got an official seal, even from Bishop d'Arcis. It just remained a rough draft and never proceeded beyond that, written by the scribe. Now, additionally, in terms of the internal evidence test, there's also controversy over the Latin words that are used in this memorandum. We don't even know what this memorandum says. That translation I just read you by Shroud skeptics, that's a creation by biased atheists and skeptics, but that's a total fiction. It doesn't exist. We don't know or can't prove historically what this document actually says. There's controversy over some of the words. Like, for example, does it say that there was an inquiry where an artist, just in general, some random artist said, that's a fake? Or does it say the artist, the one who allegedly created the shroud, confessed that the shroud was painting? We don't know, given the Latin. There's a debate there. That's a big deal for Shroud skeptics. Next up, not only that, Bishop Pierre d'Arcis, he was a meticulous lawyer. And we know for a fact elsewhere, he very carefully cites documents. He quotes precisely. But yet, he cites no dated official documents with this memorandum. He quotes nothing from the alleged artist himself in this memorandum. Interesting. Why is that? All he says is that, well, the inquest had been held, quote unquote, about 34 or so years earlier in about 1355. So the lack of the precise date there is out of character for Bishop Pierre d'Arcis elsewhere, where he is meticulous and precise. And this is very curious given the detailed records that were kept during that precise period of history in the city of Troyes, where he was the bishop, because Troyes was never captured by the English invaders during that medieval time when the English were invading France and stuff. It was never ravaged by a fire. So all of their records from the time of the 1350s up to the 1390s, as well as the detailed diocesan records of the diocese from the Bishop Henry's time onward, they would have all remained intact in Bishop Pierre d'Arcis's time. He would have been able to quote, if there was an inquiry, he would have had the quotes, the precise dates, names, all of that freely available to him, but he conveniently doesn't. And that's out of character. Everywhere else he does that, but not in this memo about the shroud. Why? He's lying. That's the hint. He's a liar. That's why. It never happened. But again, that's another problematic thing here. All right, so let's move on to the external evidence test. And by external evidence, I'm meaning more documents that kind of surround around the time in the 1300s that this memo was written. Do they speak about this matter? What do they say about the Shroud of Turin and this supposed memorandum? Okay, so surrounding the letter, so dated July 28, 1389, we have a letter by the anti-pope Clement VII, and he's giving a brief to Geoffrey II de Charny. He's the owner of the Shroud of Turin at this time. So this is about 5 months before the alleged memorandum of Bishop d'Arcis was created and supposedly sent to the Pope. And in this letter, Pope Clement, or the anti-Pope Clement, acknowledges the Charny's religious motives for showing the cloth as being good, and he agrees that it had been removed from the church and brought to safety because of war and pestilence, and he permits the showing of the cloth publicly, but he adds the caveat, calling it a figure or representation. And additionally, he mentions to the Bishop Pierre d'Arcis, Clement imposes, quote-unquote, perpetual shut your mouth, d'Arcis. He tells d'Arcis to shut his mouth perpetually and forever about this, because he's sick and tired of this dispute. So this assumes, look, Bishop d'Arcis is creating problems over this. He's whining and complaining like a little brat. And the Pope's kind of getting sick about this, so he's saying, look, de Charny's, you're good. Go ahead and show it, but just call it a figure or representation. Don't call it authentic. I'm just trying to shut Bishop d'Arcis up because I'm sick and tired of hearing him complaining. The brief itself mentions no inquest, no artist, no scandal whatsoever. Okay, the next letter that we have is a letter from the King of France. This is King Charles VI to the Bailey of Troyes. The Troyes, again, the city where Bishop Pierre d'Arcis lives. And this is dated August 4th, 1989. So in this letter, the Bishop of Troyes has stated before our curia that the church in Leary is displaying a certain handmade and artificially depicted cloth as if it were the true sudarium of Christ. So the king commands the bailey, quote-unquote, to get the cloth and bring it to me so that I might relocate it into another church in Troyes. Like perhaps the one under Bishop Pierre d'Arcis's control. How convenient. Now, an observant attorney, for example, like Teddy, might ask, well, why just months before the drafting of his memo did this Bishop d'Arcis, who was a canon lawyer, he didn't cite any damning evidence of Henry's inquest or the name of the artist, Had he done so, it would surely have been recited in the king's letter. But the king doesn't mention those details at all. Instead, the king only mentions, look, only Darcis made this charge, a false charge on his part, but the king says he made this charge. It wasn't Henry's charge, it was Bishop Darcis's charge. Interesting. It's almost like Darcy made it up at that time. Henry knew nothing about it, or had nothing to do with it. So there was no inquiry here. Next, we have a report of the Bailey of Troyes dated August 15th, 1389. So this is the Bailey that the king told to get the cloth. And he says, in effect, quote unquote, we went to the church at Leary, but the dean would not hand the cloth over to us, and we did not proceed further in the matter. Okay? Responding to this, then there's a letter from the first sergeant of the king to the Bailey of Troyes, dated September 5th, 1389. And the writer basically says he officially announced to the dean and to Geoffrey II de Charny, the owner of the Shroud of Turin, that the cloth was verbally made the property of the king. Now, historically, we know nothing in the end came of this. The king never got his mitts on the cloth after this little incident and series of letters. However, Pope Clement, we have another letter from him. And this is a letter to Bishop Pierre Darcis, and it's dated January 6, 1390. So we're increasingly getting into the future here. So this was allegedly written after the memo. Or scholars say it was written after the memo should have been written, but it doesn't refer to the memo at all. And that was customary in these things. This letter should have mentioned the memo if the memo was ever sent by Bishop Pierre Darcis to the Pope. Obviously, we know for a fact it wasn't historically. You'd be a fool if you think it was. But anyways, so this letter from Pope Clement, anti-Pope Clement the Sixth, to Bishop Pierre Darcis, says that the cloth was replaced in the church with Clement's permission, despite the bishop's prohibition, and any opposing action would be visited with excommunication. So once again, the Pope is saying, Bishop Pierre Darcis, I know you've been going with trying to get the king to stir up trouble here. Shut your mouth, or we're going to excommunicate you and damn you to hell. So the Pope's quite peeved with this Bishop Darcis. He's kind of a pestilent little cockroach of a person here. Okay, so the next document is a papal bull of Clement VII, dated January 6, 1390. And in this papal bull, he admits he has changed his mind. First, he repeats the words of his letter to Geoffrey II on the 28th of July, 1389. So he repeats that letter as was customary. Again, remember, in his previous letter to Darcis, he doesn't quote the memo. Interesting. So after that, he orders Darcis, again, shut your mouth perpetually. Just zip it. And then he follows the modifications. What has he changed his mind on? So, well, to remove every chance of error or idolatry in the display of the cloth, the Shroud of Turin, we ordain that whenever said figure or representation is displayed, one should announce loud and clear that it is not the true sudarium of the Lord, but a picture or copy only. So this is supporting kind of the Shroud skeptics. The Pope has changed his mind, and he's now saying, look, announce clearly this thing is a fake. This thing... and again, he's peeved off with Darcis telling him to shut up forever. Okay, the final document we have here is, again, a papal bull, also dated June 1st, 1390. June 1st, 1390. So this is 6 months later. Anti-Pope Clement has changed his mind again now. So he now supports the Leary Shroud, making no mention of idolatry, nor an inquiry, nor an artist, nothing, or a memo at all. And here's the gist. Look, since we have heard that crowds go to Leary out of devotion to the cloth, we, desiring to encourage this pilgrimage, enlarge the indulgence for the faithful who visit said church annually at Christmas. And we strictly prohibit anyone of whatever rank from appropriating or usurping the offerings of the faithful. Hint, Darcy, greedy little bugger, keep your greedy mitts off the money of the faithful, and trying to steal the shroud so you can get that money for yourself. So yeah, here's kind of these documents in and around surrounding the supposed date or creation of this memorandum in the midst of this controversy with Bishop Pierre Darcy. He's got an established history. He wants the Shroud of Turin so he can display it in his church in Troyes. Why would he? And he's trying to get the Pope. The Pope's telling him to shut his mouth and supports the church in Leary. So that didn't work. Darn it, let me get the king to try to get it for me. Eventually that didn't work because they hid it and stuff like that from the Baileys. And then finally he grumbles on to the Pope again, and the Pope okay, fine, I've changed my mind. You know what? Darcy, again, shut up because you annoy me. But the church in Leary, look, you have to loudly announce it's a fake. Will that shut you up, Darcy? It doesn't shut him up. He wants the money. He wants the Shroud of Turin for himself. So 6 months later, Pope Clement changes his mind again and says, look, Leary's doing everything right. It's authentic. They can show the Shroud of Turin. It's not idolatry. I don't mention inquest or a memo. Darcy, you're filth, and you're done. So in the end, the Pope supports the Church of Leary. But what do we get from this surrounding documents? It just says, look, the Pope and the King have no idea what's going on. They just know there's a controversy. They haven't seen the shroud. They don't know whether it's fake or real. They don't have a clue. They're just getting hearsay from both sides and trying to come up with a political solution to this. Darcy, you're annoying. Shut up. And okay, he keeps bugging us. Then he goes to the king. He's going to keep doing this. They hide the shroud on the king's bailey so they can't get it. And then Darcy's now again complaining to the Pope. The Pope's like, oh man, this loser will just never give up. Okay, fine. I'll get Darcy. I'm going to threaten you with excommunication, but I'm going to order them to say it's a fake. Are you happy now? He's not happy. So again, Clement says, the hell with you. 6 months later, the thing's real. Go ahead and show it. You have my full support. It's not idolatry. It's not a problem. And he's back again against the Leary Shroud. Can we prove anything about this? No. All that's proven is, look, there was no inquiry. There was no artist that confessed to having made the shroud that's mentioned in any of these letters, and they should have been. And there's no memo. Bishop Darcy never sent the memo because it would have been explicitly mentioned and quoted in the correspondences of the Pope and the King if he had sent such a thing. So it's absolute historical proof that this memo was never sent or part of the official record, and very probably there was no inquiry or artist. But here's where it gets even worse for you Shroud skeptics. We've got one more document or letter that's external to this memorandum that absolutely proves your faults. It's a letter from who? Well, it is a letter from Bishop Henry de Poitiers, the one who allegedly held the inquiry. Remember, Bishop Pierre Darcy said, my predecessor, Bishop Henry de Poitiers, some 34 to 40 years, around 1355, he was the bishop at that time. I took over for him, but he's the one. He held an inquiry, and the artist or an artist confessed that the shroud was a fake to get money, just for the purpose to get money. Does Bishop Henry mention this inquiry or this artist confessing? Whoops. Big problem for you Shroud skeptics. No, he says the opposite. So he says he wrote a letter addressed to Geoffrey I de Charny. So he was the owner of the Shroud of Turin in the 1350s. He was the original owner in Europe when they started showing it. And this letter is dated May 28th, 1356, after the time of the alleged inquiry. And what does this letter say? Well, it says that the bishop fully supported the church at Leary and their showings of the shroud. He had no problem with what was going on at the church of Leary. It mentions no inquest or inquiry into the Shroud of Turin. Henry praises Geoffrey de Charny's piety and religiosity as a holy man. He says, quote unquote, as we have been informed by legal documents, we praise, ratify, and approve of the divine cult of this sort. The Turin Shroud is not mentioned at all. Henry has not gone to Leary personally, but he has been informed from others. So this letter directly denies and contradicts the memorandum by Bishop Darcis written 40 years earlier. This is about the guy. This is the guy that he says held the inquiry. Well, we have a letter by the guy, Bishop Henry himself, and he says complete rubbish. They're good guys. You're a liar, Darcis. I never held an inquiry. I never did anything against them. I had no problem with them showing the Shroud of Turin at all. There was no artist who confessed to me that they created the Shroud of Turin. This is a pure lie. And this is interesting because, Bishop Henry died just like 4 months later, which would have been impossible for him to have an inquiry after he wrote this letter into the Shroud of Turin. So this just shows you it's complete rubbish that Bishop Darcis is making things up. He just lied. Now, why would he lie? And I've kind of hinted throughout this, and it's because he was greedy. He accuses the Church of Leary of being greedy, suffering from the sin of avarice. They all want money from these pilgrims by showing the Shroud of Turin. Well, who was really the greedy, avarice one? It was Bishop Pierre Darcis. That's why he made up this memo. That's why he lied and said that the artist confessed and that there was an inquiry. And then realized, this is complete historical horse trash. I can't send this out. Everyone will all be a laughing stock. So this scribe screwed up, so I'm not going to sign it. I'm not going to date it. This will just remain a rough draft and get rid of this stuff. He realized the folly of the ways and never sent it. Because everyone knew it was complete rubbish. But why would he lie? Why? Well, he's greedy. He wants the money for himself. This was a church just outside of his control, which means it was independent. He didn't get the money. He wanted it for himself. Okay, well, why would he want that? External evidence test can appeal to circumstances, and we can speak to his motive. There are circumstances relevant to his motive here, in that at Christmas time of the year 1389, his entire church collapsed, and a huge stained glass window fell out, was instantly destroyed, and these are extremely expensive in these times. So, of course, Bishop Pierre Darcis is greedy. He wants all the moolah for himself to fix up his church, and these external circumstances provide absolute proof as to a plausible motivation for why he would lie and make up this memo, pretend that it's an artist. Remember, he's not doing this out of pure motives. It's an artist and we held an inquiry and all this stuff. The shroud's a fake. Yeah, but by the same token, you're trying to get the king to steal the Shroud of Turin to give to you so you can charge money from showing the Shroud of Turin, even though you allegedly know it's an artistic fake. Yeah, we really believe you there, Darcis. You're a liar. You're a greedy liar, and you should be ashamed of yourself for all time for what you did. So, yeah, that's in the end, that's the assessment of this memorandum. Let me see if there's anything else. Yeah, that's it. So that's what this is all about. It's complete nonsense. But yet, the skeptics, David Johnson and Darren Lute, said they were thoroughly convinced by this evidence. Yeah, well, by that same token, they should be just show them the Gospel of Mark. They should be thoroughly convinced that that's true. They should believe that Jesus walked on water. Let's see if they really will be consistent with their methodology and reasoning skills on this front. But yeah, I think for all the critical thinkers in the audience, we can tell this memorandum is garbage. Throw it out. It's complete historical horse trash. No proof. All the proof is against it being authentic and speaking to an actual inquiry where the artist confessed to creating the shroud in the 1300s. It's just rubbish as evidence. So yeah, that's my take on that.
In fact, let me just ask, what did you have for your notes?
Well, a lot of mine was, in the claims that were being made. Because when you hear two people making a bunch of claims on a podcast like this, one of the reasons it's so hard to follow is because no one has access to the same materials that convinced the two people talking of their position. So they're basically just being told the conclusion without having any indication of how they actually got to that conclusion. And I think that's really hard to do on a podcast. It's one of the reasons that I'm not a huge fan of debates, because it's basically just a bunch of claims going one way or the other. As an example, like, are you familiar with the ancient aliens?
Which ones? You mean the ones that came and made the Egyptian temples? Or?
Yeah, basically. But anyways, the logic
I
behind
watched Stargate.
Yeah, so the logic behind that movement is that we have some of these huge sites that have these megalith stones that the locals could not have possibly moved around, or at least that's the claim, or created. So they needed, extraterrestrial help in order to make these sites. And it's sort of funny because there's one of these sites where they say the stone was too hard, the stone was a certain type, it was too hard for the Bronze Age tools to carve. It's too precise. It's too smooth. You don't see the tool marks. So it must have been aliens that came down and made these stone structures. Well, the problem with this claim is that the stone that it's made out of is not what the ancient aliens is claiming it is. It's a much softer stone. We have the actual tools that they were using in half-used or half-completed stone structures. We've got the writings of how they did it. We've got you can even go down and do it yourself, because they've got a little museum there that you can actually go in and play with a little bit. And so the entire claim from beginning to end is just bogus and then the ancient aliens proponents are using this claim to try to prove their point. And I noticed that it's sort of the same thing with the Shroud proponents, because Teddy said a couple times that no paint, dye, or stain can account for the Shroud. Well, when you actually look into that claim, you realize that it's not exactly true. What they mean is that no paint, dye, or stain that the person doing the experiment thought of or knew the capabilities of how it would react with the fibers could do it. And so, as Hugh was pointing out, there are a lot of things that the medieval artists were doing that most modern day artists and scientists were not aware of. So when she says things like, we know that this can't be done, that's not entirely accurate. All it is that the things that we've tried and we know about have been subjectively ruled out.
So what you're describing for me is, I think, going to be my ultimate sticking point throughout the series, and I continue to try to get over these things that I know are sticking points and try to listen to what's being said with as open a mind as possible. But correct me if I'm wrong, the entire Shroud argument is just a giant argument for ignorance. It's a fallacy, and it is the most trivial of arguments for me. Whenever an argument comes down to, I can't imagine how blank. And at that point, I just don't care. I don't care what's in the blank. I don't care what the other parts of the equation are. There are lots of things that people can do that we can't figure out how they do it.
Yeah.
Today. Forget back then. And then, we have this persistent problem, the arrogance of the incumbent who thinks that they know more and are smarter than, more capable than whoever came before them. And so we have this is played out with every generation, going back to cavemen. And so, you get a few generations removed, and you can always say, well, I don't know how they would ever come up with blank. And so we always have an inflated sense of our capabilities and a deflated sense of the capabilities of the people who've come before us. So it is simply because I do not know how, someone put an image on a cloth with these properties does not make me wonder about it or spend my life trying to solve the puzzle. If someone else wants to spend their life trying to solve the puzzle, it's fine. But there's nothing that compels me, because I am not surprised that they could do some things that we can't figure out how to do. We have a different set of tools. We have a different world to manipulate. And quite frankly, necessity is the mother of invention. We don't have the same necessities as they did. If we want to put an image on a cloth, we could do it a lot better today. We wouldn't think, it wouldn't occur to us to do whatever they did. And we may not even have the materials that, some desert dweller had 600 years ago. I have no idea. It's just trivial to me to consider that people from ages ago could do a thing that I cannot reproduce today.
Okay, so let me address this next little bit from objection from Darren, and David chimes in. So there's a lot of elements here. Again, they're typical lay skeptic, argument from ignorance nonsense that I refuted before. But let's start off with Darren's laughable and fallacious, logically fallacious, another fallacy from these funny lay skeptics, giving a false analogy using the ancient aliens argument about the megalith stones and how it's not true what the ancient aliens say, and this is analogous to the Shroud of Turin proponents. Complete nonsense, disanalogous. Only a fool, and Darren's a fool, would believe that this is a good argument. So in the first place, Darren Lute, I've seen ancient aliens debunked too. I know more than you do about it. So let's see if it's comparable to the Shroud in any way, and if it really is analogous. In the first place, they claim to have very heavy stones made of a very hard material that can't be penetrated and all that. So ancient aliens are lying about the facts. Is that what Shroud proponents do? Is that what I did? Or Teddy? No. My minimal relevant features, scientifically proven facts. Everyone, atheists, skeptics, agnostics, or Pro-Shroud, all agree with me. I'm right, you're wrong, Darren. It's not a lie. I don't base the Shroud argument on false facts. They're scientifically proven facts published in secular peer-reviewed journals. No one with a functioning brain and with any degree of knowledge believes that they're a lie. That's a disanalogy. Ancient Aliens bases it on false facts, not their lies. The stone isn't as hard. Nobody says that the Shroud of Turin's facts are lies. It is superficial. It does have body image uniformity. It does produce topographical information. So you've been destroyed, Darren. And sorry for being very passionate about these. These SNS skeptics have been a thorn in my side for quite a while, and they're still going after me, spreading lies, misinformation to this day. So there's a little bit of oomph in my wanting to refute these people and their lies and misrepresentations and intellectual laziness, and they're trying to refute the Shroud and that sort of thing. So just ignore that if you can. But also it's disanalogous in another way. So great, we've got the facts. But Darren Lute says, well, look what the ancient aliens figured out how they've done it. We know historically how ancient peoples moved these stones. And in fact, we've got a museum where you yourself can go and see, with a little mock-up, to see how they moved these megalith stones. So we know how they moved the stones. Is that analogous to the Shroud of Turin? Nope. Totally unique. We don't have a dang clue.
how they created the Shroud of Turin's images. Another disanalogy, faulty analogy, you are a fallacious fool, Darren. My gosh, you must feel like a fool right now. Okay, let's put that aside. Look, it's totally disanalogous. We don't know how the Shroud of Turin and all of our techniques are completely useless. That's not the case with ancient aliens. We know for a fact how they did it. The ancient alien proponents are nothing like the Shroud of Turin proponents. Just dismiss everything Darren Lute has to say here. He doesn't have a clue what he's talking about. And he's just totally irrational and illogical. In addition to that, though, they again make this argument from ignorance. I already addressed that. No, it's not. We have positive knowledge. It's based on the positive knowledge and positive criteria of what we know. And I love this little bit where David Johnson comes in and starts talking. They had techniques. They were brilliant geniuses who had techniques we didn't even know about. And we can't reproduce today. It's not fair. There's circumstances that are different. Blah, 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 blah. Well, yes, that's true, of course. But are you really so foolish to think that that matters? I mean, in the first place, we had, with all the paints and dyes and everything like that, we had a complete list, absolutely complete, of every known artistic material, and those were all tested for and all failed. So yeah, they didn't have another kind of paint that we just didn't know about. But even if they did, who cares? The fact is, with these minimal relevant features, it's not about, oh, well, maybe they had techniques we didn't think of or something like that. The fact is, we have the laws of nature. And it's a scientifically proven fact that the laws of nature are the same today as they were in the medieval period. If David Johnson or Darren Lute want to make the argument that, well, the laws of nature, the laws of physics were different back in the medieval times, great. Thanks for believing in miracles. The Shroud is a miracle then. Supernatural proof of God. Obviously, they don't want to do that. We know for a fact that the laws of nature were the same in the medieval period as they were today. And the Shroud of Turin violates the laws of nature, the laws of physics and chemistry. That's why we know. It doesn't matter what technique they use. They cannot violate the laws of physics. Something like paint, for example, will not create superficial images. Physically impossible. Doesn't matter whether they used a super duper paintbrush or a mini deluxe 2000 paintbrush that we don't have access to today or something like that. Doesn't matter. It violates the laws of physics. So this is just a ridiculous claim from ignorance, basically, on the part of the Shroud skeptic. They are the ones that are making the argument of ignorance, desperate not to believe in the truth. So they just mindlessly say, well, somehow they had a miraculous technique that we don't know about. Or even worse, they're saying, well, maybe in the medieval period they could violate the laws of physics. No, skeptics, no. Unless you have God and or a supernatural entity, you cannot violate the laws of physics. It doesn't matter what techniques we know or don't know about. So this is just a ridiculous objection by these Shroud skeptics. It's them making an argument from ignorance. We don't know how it was created without God. Therefore, God didn't do it. We'll just assume they have a technique, even if it means violating the laws of physics themselves. We'll still hang on to, out of desperation, that somehow, some way it happened because we don't want it to be a miracle of God. Come on, David and Darren, we deserve better than this. Put on your thinking caps. Try not to be just so biased against stuff. All right, let's continue on with these two chuckleheads and see what they have up next.
Yeah. It really boils down to the same thing for me as well. When you have when you're talking about the reasonableness to believe something, you have to, in my mind, you have to look at the underlying logic. Because if you are going to use the logic that because we can't figure it out using natural means, that means God did it.
Oh. Okay, so I'm so sorry to interrupt these clips. I like to give the full clips for full context to be as fair as I can and charitable as I can to these guys, but I just need to interject at this moment and say, how many times do we have to go with this argument from ignorance and, I can't figure it out, therefore God did it. We get it, Darren. It's like these skeptics just have one objection. They say it over and over and over again. Anyways, I refuted this like 50 billion times now, so let's get back in and finish this off here. What do they have to say?
Then if you're going to be consistent, then you also have to apply that logic, however fallacious it is, to the God question as well. And you also, not only can you not figure out how it was done naturally, you also can't figure out how it was done supernaturally. So if you're using that logic, then you have to say, well, I can't figure out how it was done supernaturally, therefore it was done naturally. And that's why that line of thinking is so fallacious, because it works equally well on both sides and tells you absolutely nothing about what is actually true. Even if everything that Teddi comes up with in this series is accurate and true and 100% correct, all she's really getting to is we don't know how it was done naturally. We don't know. And then there's nothing at all to say, okay, well, there's no way to take the next step and say, okay, well, if it wasn't done naturally, how is it done supernaturally? And you have to take that next step if you're going to make it reasonable to believe that the supernatural does it. Otherwise, you're just stuck in, I don't know.
Yeah, there's some more stuff that I'll say online. I hope that everyone enjoyed the show and the after show. Darren, will you be willing to do this again when the other two are ready to regroup and
Sure, absolutely.
Yeah, I'll try to retain more of the technical stuff, but right now I haven't been given a good reason to do that much technical research for this, and I guess it's not like it's beyond me to go out there and do it or get a minor degree in biology so I can understand this stuff or ancient art. But right now, I just haven't been given a good enough reason yet, and so we'll see how this unfolds. Again, thanks for your time, and thank you, audience, for listening.
All right, so that's the last final clip I'm going to play here, and I think the last little bit kind of reveals the real game here with these skeptics, where David Johnson is revealing, look, in contradicting what I said earlier, where this is just way beyond me. No, it's not. No, he can understand it if he applies himself, but he doesn't want to. In his words, he hasn't been, quote unquote, given a reason to. Well, here's a reason, David. How about your eternal destiny, heaven or hell, salvation or damnation? That's a pretty convincing reason to get off your keister and apply yourself a little bit, I would say. The real reason is, look, you don't want to believe the truth. You don't want to believe in Christianity, so therefore you're never going to... No reason can be compelling enough to convince you to listen. Certainly you've heard enough of the amazing scientific discoveries on the Shroud that should prompt you to go, there's something here that I should get to the bottom with, especially if my eternal destiny is on the line here. But like you said, your eternal destiny, that quote-unquote is not a good enough reason for you to care about getting to the bottom of some of this stuff, even though none of it is beyond you, in your own words. Instead, it's obvious. What David and Darren, those like him, are really looking for is an easy, quick excuse to disbelieve that the Shroud is correct. And I know this for a fact because I know them personally, both in public and privately. And this is absolutely true about their characters. They're just looking for some quick and easy catchphrase that they can say to go, oh, well, I'm disbelieving the Shroud. I'm rational and disbelieving the Shroud and just ignoring all the evidence because you're just making an argument from ignorance. So it's all irrelevant. I don't have to look at it. Oh, now I feel good. I can comfort myself with my little skeptical blankie and just not have to turn on my brain and actually get into the details of this. Oh, so comforting, right, skeptics? It's obvious that that's what you're doing. You're looking. The only thing you want with the Shroud is, oh shoot, this is so compelling. I just need a quick and easy answer, a quick and easy defeater for it that I can just pull out of my rumps whenever I'm challenged with it, and therefore I don't have to get into the details. I can just say, oh, argument from ignorance. Oh, okay, now I'm done. That's pathetic. And you're only cheating yourself in the end. I mean, it's your soul that's on the line here. It's not going to affect me. I'm going to be in eternal bliss forever. But you're going to be screwed. So I suggest, quick and easy answers. That's not what you should be going for here. So yeah, I think that says it all. That's really revealing about the way most people are when they're skeptical about the shroud. Most lay people just dismiss it. Oh, I saw on CNN. I saw on this little, Newsweek or something like that, a magazine in a grocery store, that the shroud's a fake. That's good enough for me. I just mindlessly believe it. And that's good enough for these people. No, that's not good enough. You need to do way better than that. You need to at least, I mean, I'm not saying devote your life to studying the shroud. Even I don't do that. I have varied interests. I like I like being a jack of all trades. Obviously, the shroud's important to me, and that's why I want to do my full series and present the evidence as best I can, and I have a genuine interest in it. But I've got many different interests, and I try to balance my life. So no one's making unreasonable demands. We're just saying, roll up your sleeves a little bit and do some work, and it reminds me, I kind of sent David, I'm like, just one source on the Shroud of Turin, and this is an all-encompassing source. It's written at a popular level. It's got helpful pictures for you. And I just said, can you just at least read this? He read about a quarter of it, quarter to halfway, I think, and then he said he just gave up after that. And he said he just wasn't interested or something. So he couldn't even read one source on it. Come on, that's not being a real seeker. It's definitely David's fault for his non-belief. He will be blamed, and properly blamed by God when he's being sent to hell on Judgment Day, because he was presented with an opportunity and he just didn't want to take it. He has the evidence available to him right now, so does Darren, to find out the truth that Christianity is true. And they push it away and mock it and say, Dale and Teddy, you are kooks. His words, he called us kooks just because we've studied the evidence from the shroud and find it persuasive. So yeah, I think that kind of attitude, that's the real problem in this world today. It's why David and Darren aren't persuaded by the shroud evidence, because by their own admission, they're totally ignorant. They don't know anything about it. And yet, they know enough to say, oh, well, it's just kookery. There's nothing to it. Come on now. Come on. Yeah, with that, I'll leave it there. So yeah, next week we're going to have Dr. Egel German. I do want to finish off my Jesus Mythicism Refuted solo show part 5 on the Jewish rabbinic sources. I was finished it, but I had a technical glitch, so I have to go back and re-record stuff when I get a chance after my MRP is finished or my thesis. But yeah, otherwise, have a good week. I hope this is kind of a change in format. It's more of a review episode on some popular level shroud skeptics. Obviously, you can tell I was a bit tired. I was doing this late at night, so I injected a bit of humor and vigor against my quote-unquote interlocutors or opponents in this case. Yeah, enjoy the show and take care and have a good week. Bye-bye.